Welcome to California in Focus. I'm Eliana Kernodle. The Environmental Protection Agency has issued a waiver to allow California and the 12 other states that have adopted its emission standards to ban gas-powered cars in 2035. Joining me with more on this story is the Center Square's California reporter, Kenneth Schrupp. Kenneth, tell us about this waiver and what it does.
Hey, Eliana. The EPA under the Biden administration has just issued a waiver to let California and the 12 other states that have adopted its car emission standards to ban gas-powered cars for new vehicle sales starting in 2035. But this starts going into effect much sooner, starting in model year 2026, which for most car manufacturers starts sometime in 2025, usually in the summer. 35% of passenger vehicles sold in California in the states that have adopted the California standards for passenger vehicles must be electric or hybrid or plug-ins. These 12 states plus California, which includes Washington, D.C., cover about half of America's newer light-duty vehicle and quarter of its heavy-duty vehicle market. So these are some really big changes.
And what are some of the legal controversies that have surrounded these EPA waivers that California has?
Well, the Supreme Court is somewhat involved in cases about this, but I think we have to go back a little bit further to see why California gets to set its own standards and what this sort of question is about. California specifically started regulating its air before the EPA existed. That's because in the Los Angeles area, the geography captures the smog in the area and traps it. And that's why we get these big smog clouds in LA that were so infamous for a long time until we started putting in new fuel standards and tailpipe emission standards. So there was a legitimate reason why California started regulating its own air. And after the EPA was created, it was grandfathered in with this power to set its own air standards. Fast forward, the only way that states can have air standards that aren't the federal standard is if they accept the California standard. In the 2000s, California started recognizing carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases as emissions and pollution. This is controversial because carbon dioxide is a naturally occurring, very common substance on our planet, in our atmosphere, and in the universe, and in and of itself isn't toxic or dangerous. Now, as we've seen more states adopt California's air regulations, the question of whether or not California can directly or indirectly regulate interstate commerce is a larger question as these start applying to heavy-duty transportation. For example, what happens with all of the trains that have to go through California that currently operate on deal? How about the trucks that take goods between ports? California is where all of the nation's Pacific exports come in. It's also where all of our exports to Asia go out from. What about the imports coming in from Mexico through the California border that might come from the rest of South America? These are all big questions for interstate commerce, and California's air standards are playing a big role in that.
And with the new Trump administration coming in, it does kind of raise some questions, seeing as the last time there was a Trump administration, it did challenge or try to stop some of these waivers.
That's right. So right now, this waiver is something called Advanced Clean Cars 2. This is for a new regulatory regime that starts model year 2026 and goes until 2035, continues into the indefinite future, regulating light vehicles, which is pretty much what most passenger cars are. The Trump administration withdrew the EPA waiver for Clean Cars 1, and there was a big court battle that was never really resolved. The Supreme Court decided not to rule on the case, and by the time the Biden administration came into power, they just decided to reinstate the waiver without really a full definitive answer to this question. Last week, the Supreme Court again kind of punted a EPA waiver for California case, but decided to partially hear the question by considering whether or not producers of fuel or other interest groups have the standing to challenge California's emissions rules. So it's probably going to rule on that this cycle. The next cycle, it might be more amenable to ruling on the actual question itself.
Is there any other important things we need to know about this story?
Yeah, I think what we have to look at is what's going to happen to the average consumer if these car manufacturers can't meet the requirements. according to the California New Car Dealers Association, almost 26% of new vehicles sold in California in the third quarter of 2024 were all electric or plug-in hybrids. This means meeting the 35% mandate next year might be impossible, or at least that's what Toyota CEO said, that going from 25.6% to 35% within a year does not seem very realistic, especially because these plug-in and EV vehicles are so expensive. Earlier, we reported on the average monthly financing cost of an EV is over $700. Most Americans really can't afford that. And that's the cost after rebates. That's a very expensive car, especially at a time when people feel inflation pinching their real earnings. So car dealers or car manufacturers, they're going to get fined $20,000 per Zero Emissions vehicle credit they're short. They get a credit for every car that they do sell that is zero emissions, but if they don't have enough credits, they're going to have to buy them from other automakers with excess credits, possibly at a higher cost, much higher than $20,000. What Jeep decided to do when they thought they couldn't get enough of these credits was make non-hybrid vehicles special order only in California and the other states that adopted its standard. If this shortage of credits happens for dealers and automakers next year, we could see a lot of popular vehicles just being unavailable for sale in California.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at thecentersquare.com.